So welcome to Visual Studio Online, an update every 3 weeks. My name is Randall, and I'm a partner with MCW Technologies. I do a lot of stuff, but primarily as a consultant, I focus on helping teams improve their development processes and how they build software. And I do that primarily focused on Microsoft Stack, and specifically Visual Studio, Team Foundation Server, and now Visual Studio Online, which is what this talk is primarily about. I'm an MVP, I've been so for about 11 years, and as an ALM MVP, that means I'm focused on the tools of Visual Studio around the teams and processes. I still write code, and I do love writing code, but you don't typically hire me to write code anymore. It's more to analyze how your team can improve from development to test to architecture to DevOps and implementation. I work with ProSite. I'm recording a course on Visual Studio Online that if I ever get it done, my editor will have a heart attack. And I co-authored a book on application lifecycle management with Visual Studio 2013 and Team Foundation Server 2013. It's available now at amazon.co.uk, and if you buy it, I might get 25 pence, so that's awesome. Email address, Twitter handle, and my blog address for further harassment if need be. So this talk is about TFS in Azure. And what that means is Microsoft sat down and as a company knew that they were going to work on a system in the cloud. Thank you. That was right. Hold on, a shorter period. They knew that the cloud was going to be important to the long-term vision. And so they started thinking about what would Team Foundation Server, Microsoft's ALM hub, look like if it was a cloud service. And they started out in a preview mode. They showed it off at one of the last PDCs, I believe was fall of 2009. And it was in a long pre-release period up until fall of 2013 when it officially went in general availability. Later in 2014, they flipped the bit, completely took away the preview status and early adopter status, which basically means they started charging money and also started to guarantee an SLA. And so this talk is about Visual Studio Online, which includes many things, but it includes what people think of as TFS in the cloud. And the key thing is that it has a rich web-based interface that allows you to access almost all the services. And then when it comes to things like source control, they support both traditional version control as well as Git-based version control repositories, which means it's open just about any platform out there. So, Microsoft hemmed and hawed what to call it. It was called TFS Preview, TFS Service, TF Service, all these things. But they finally came up with a branding called Visual Studio Online. And the downside of this nomenclature is it means more than just the core TFS features. And so I'll address that, and hopefully it'll be clear to you. But once again, the marketing guys are trying to focus on brand, and I guess they get noticeable, they learn that stuff, and this is how they do that. In either case, sometimes for customers, it's hard to figure out what you want and what you need. So hopefully I can make that clear. So ALM is an industry term, and when we think about ALM, application lifecycle management, we're thinking about 3 tenets: governance, development, and operations. In the traditional software development lifecycle, we've often focused on that cycle of when a developer starts coding to when they stop coding. Everything around it is kind of ephemeral to the entire process. And as an industry, we've been maturing both how we write code and how we do things as a team, but also how that interacts with the larger enterprise. And so ALM as an industry term is meant to kind of provide that vision. And so we think about ALM and things like governance, we're thinking about, well, who's going to pay for this software? Right? You know, the notion of free software is great, but unless you're wealthy, right, and inherited a bunch of money, somehow, some way you make a living doing something to pay for that. And if you work in a software shop or in an organization that has a software department, you're getting paid because there's some other business that is generating revenue. Does anybody work for a pure software company? Okay, so you do. What do you guys build? What kind of software?
Rostering software for the health mechs, for the NHS. Rostering software.
All right. So so you write software related to the healthcare system here? Okay, great. I forgot I had to repeat it for the mic. Well, Other than that, the rest of you are working in some other organization that uses software. In fact, in my talk yesterday, I made the point that every company is a software company today. If you don't have software, you're probably not very modern or very functioning. Sure, the local butcher shop might be able to get away with it, okay? But even then, if you want to be paid anymore, it's really hard to be a cash-only business, to the fact that governments tend to frown on cash-only businesses, particularly high volumes, right? So you really need to point that probably at some technology for your accounting, right? Maybe very simple, it might be something as simple as Microsoft Excel. But at the end of the day, technology permeates just about everything we do. So we start thinking about teams building software, we start thinking about how do we manage them. So ALM is about that. Now, Microsoft then in 2010 rebranded their suite of tools around this area. Originally it was called Team System, and they went with this broader branding called Visual Studio ALM. And the whole point is that they're trying to show that they care about the entire life cycle. And in different places they have extensions or they have just a little bit of features. In other places they're very deep. They're definitely very deep in that core development area. They're getting much deeper on the operations area. And when it comes to governance, they have some things, but that's probably the area that they can do the most work on. But once again, you'll find that when you think about agile software development, we tend to want to have less is more approach to governance. So when we think about Visual Studio Online versus Team Foundation Server, it's important to have a baseline of where we're coming from. Team Foundation Server, as Microsoft's ALM hub, is a server you install in your organization. From a logical standpoint, it provides your core services that every development team should have. Version control, some type of work tracking, the ability to do team builds where you bring things together on a separate build server to check for errors and issues. Right? From there, we start thinking about more interesting ideas. For example, how can our teams collaborate better? So things like team rooms are an example of something they have as a way to document what's going on, as well as have discussions in digital format that are specific to your team project and the thing you're working on, as opposed to just a casual IM conversation using Skype or some other technology. We think about this notion of feedback management. How do we know we're building the right thing for our users? How do they tell us what's going on? And those things, as you'll see in the diagram, are kind of under this archway, this core set of things we expect to have. Then Microsoft has these extension services that may or may not be used depending upon your team. For example, if you look, start over here, lab management. The ability to take your output from a build, have it automatically pushed into one or more virtual environments or even possibly real machines, and then do some kind of automated testing as well as manual testing to see if it's what you're supposed to be building, test for quality. Release management tools, the ability to go beyond getting into the build server, but actually get it into those various environments that are production test environments, UAT environments, and ultimately the live world out there. Load testing. The old adage, what worked on my machine doesn't work well when it falls over when you put it on the public web server. So you might want to test your web services, your website, to see if it can perform well under load. Then there's SharePoint. SharePoint is one of those things that is interesting. It has a lot of positives to it, particularly for non-team members and non-developers interacting with the team, a way to share specifications, analyst documents, etc. SharePoint's fallen out of grace with the TFS team for a while because SharePoint on its own is it's like its own ecosystem, right? It's like its own operating system in some ways. And so they're rethinking how they integrate with that. But it is available for teams that want that. And that gives you a gateway to project server integration. Project server really fits into that larger scale concept of governance in that if you think about some software projects, they're actually one small piece of a larger pie. My go-to example is airlines, right? If you look at Boeing and Airbus, right? The modern aircraft that these airline companies have built are huge, amazing pieces of technology in and of themselves. None of their modern planes, like we take the Airbus A380 or the Boeing 787, would function without software, right? They are fly-by-wire, not fly-by hydraulics and technology from the cockpit, right? The fact that the stick and yoke has any feedback is all a mechanism of the software working in conjunction with the hardware, right? You're not physically controlling the rudder of an A380 from the stick in the cockpit. It's just not possible. It's not reasonable. And so if you're at one of those companies, you're thinking of the budget of how you do that. You have to budget for the software, but that's just one piece of a larger thing, right? And so in organizations like that, you tend to have large-scale project management software, And that software then wants to know, yes, there's this team doing software, and they're gonna make some deadlines, but I might not care about how they do it. I might care if they do Scrum or some other form of Agile, if they're doing waterfall. All I care is that they hit their dates and that they have certain resources and it costs me something. And so for teams that use Microsoft technology, you can integrate your Team Foundation Server project with Project Server, and this allows you to provide that PMO with enough data to where they can look at what you're doing, but not care about the details. So they can see things at a larger scale of features or epics, and all the way down to PBIs or backlogs, requirements. But they don't necessarily care about specifically what you're doing, but they might care about hours, depending upon how things are tracked. But it does give you a separation of concerns there, so the dev team doesn't have to get overwhelmed by working with that system. It can be synchronized automatically. And the people who like Project and Project Server can sit there and run their reports, create their Gantt charts, and figure out their dates. Okay. And then last but not least on the side here we have System Center. System Center is Microsoft's operations suite that does all sorts of great, wonderful things. And a couple entry points is one, with lab management, you use System Center Virtual Machine Manager, which is a set of technology that lets you manage Hyper-V virtual machines as well as interacts with VMware and other stacks. In addition, System Center has something called System Center Operations Manager, which allows you to monitor your production applications and find errors. And they've done some really interesting integration with Scrum in the form of TFS work item synchronization, as well as alert management, where if something bad happens in production, that data can be pushed through the work item sync, and if necessary, the dev team can say, give me more detailed information. And something called an IntelliTrace log can be generated from your production website or services and fed over to the TFS team. So Microsoft has a very rich set of solutions for an on-premises environment where you want to install and maintain the server. Now, but this whole cloud thing comes apart, and what you'll notice here is nothing changed underneath. All the same things that are here underneath the archway are available on Visual Studio Online. The difference is they started thinking about, well, what would be a little different in the cloud? Well, one thing is that maybe instead of having a dedicated build server per user, you allocate build servers on demand. You give a user a build server when they need it, so you only pay for what you need. So they created something called the Elastic Build Service. Now, build is still available here because you can run a local build server inside your organization, or possibly in a VM in the cloud, when you need more control over the build server. This is particularly important if you have specialized software that has to be installed. Maybe you're doing native code in C++, or maybe you're still doing COM, right? COM is still widely used out there. Those things don't work well in Elastic Build Server because they don't provide you with admin rights. The stuff you use to build has to be something that can be either pre-installed by Microsoft, so things like Visual Studio, the core .NET framework, and a lot of the core libraries you'd expect. But if you need something specialized that would require admin rights to install, you can't use that on the Elastic Build Server. So you could actually maintain your own build server for those specialized builds. In addition, we did get into some more fringe technologies that don't fit that maybe 80% use case that you might want to build, and that's what you can do there. It's also a way to integrate non-Windows build servers, like say you need to use a Jenkins or a Hudson server or something else, or even an OS X build server, right? Apple's pretty adamant about how you do things with their technology, so you need a Mac involved. And so there's ways to mitigate that through an on-premise solution. So you can have both though. Load testing. Load testing on premises requires you set up a load test controller and one or more load test agents, and you got to set the infrastructure of what you're going to test. And once you do all that, you can be into literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in hardware and software costs. Not to mention, how many of you know how to set up a load test rig right now and can do it in an hour? Anybody? Can anybody do it in 5 minutes? Oh, well, this I can do that. Because the load test service is up in the cloud. Microsoft's built up infrastructure. I just say how many agents I want, provide them with my load test, and they go out and just automatically spin it up and target. Now, my target of load test has to be accessible from the internet. That is the downside to it. So there's some trade-offs. There might be reasons why you want to still have on-premises load testing. In addition, there might be a cost advantage to doing it on-premises if you're going to do it a lot, particularly long-running builds. As you can see, the load testing service has a baseline where they give you some basic minutes in your account, and then you buy more minutes per virtual user after that. So once again, there's trade-offs, but they give you an interesting choice. If you've never set up a load test rig, the fact that you can do load testing in 5 minutes is a pretty compelling situation. Then we keep going, continuous deployment to Azure. This is something that just makes a lot of sense. I can do continuous delivery and continuous deployment on premises with TFS. Well, it makes sense that if my TFS servers in the cloud, I'd want to be able to do cloud-based deployments. And that's exactly what I can do, and I'll show you an example of that later. Application insights is something I want to talk about a bit more in my next talk this afternoon. But basically, analytics. How do we know we're building the right thing? How are we getting information about how our application is doing in production? As well as, how do we know which features our users are using so we can make decisions about where to invest in? And that's a feature that's in preview right now. Microsoft's been going through a lot of evolution as they listen to feedback. And finally, code editing. What if you only need to make a minor change? What if you didn't need to sit and write code for hours and debug, but you really just need to touch something up? Wouldn't it be great if you could do that in an online environment that had things like IntelliSense and maybe even was backed by some kind of version control? Well, we see a preview of this in what's known as the Monaco experience as part of Visual Studio Online. So Microsoft is really trying to think about what would be a great cloud-based experience for teams. And that's what this is about. So let's show you how you get started, and then we'll talk about pricing and we'll go deeper into the features. The first thing to understand is that you can get started with Visual Studio Online for free. You don't have to give Microsoft any money. You simply need to sign up with the Windows Live ID and go to visualstudio.com. Now, a couple things you'll notice, I am on OS 10. And the Visual Studio Online web experience is pure JavaScript HTML. There's no ActiveX, no Silverlight, nothing, no Java, right? It's a rich experience that works cross-platform. And with their inclusion now of Git as a version control option, that means you've opened it up to just about any platform that does development. Git has become the de facto industry standard when it comes to distributed version control. And so they give you the choice of those two. Now, you'll need a Windows Live ID. Now, I'm logged in with one of my existing ones, and I don't want to use that. So I'm going to log on with a different one. And assuming it'll log me out of all my different accounts there. There we go, and we'll go back. Great. And so what I'm going to do here is say sign in. And it's going to ask me for my ID. Now I've created a test account for some other work, and so I'm going to use that. If you don't have a live ID, I'd be surprised if you do any Microsoft development, but if you don't do Microsoft development, this might be new to you. So if you need a live ID, just go to outlook.com, say you need an ID, and that'll give you a free email account. But the important part is it gives you this live ID. Your live ID, by the way, can be your real email address. There's a way to set that up also. When you set up an account, if it's just for you, that's fine, use whatever makes you happy. If you're doing it for yourself, I would recommend you use a personal email address. That way your company doesn't believe they have any rights to your personal stuff. If you're setting up for a company, it's something you want to plan and think about, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit when we talk about different options for authentication. But at the end of the day, if you want to get started for free and try this out on your own, get yourself a live ID, and then log on. And let's see if I can remember my super secret password. Great, and then I haven't logged in at all. So the first time I log in, it says, hey, tell us what your name is, because they don't know what it is. When you create a live ID, you have the choice to call it anything you want. In fact, this one is a training account, so it's not even a human name. So what I'll do is I'll type my name, and we'll do CF there. And then it checks your contact email. And this can be different than your live ID. For a lot of people, their live ID only exists because they need to log into Microsoft services, like their MSDN subscription. They don't ever use the email for it. So you can switch the email account here to be something different. In addition, later there's a profile setting that lets you change it also. This is actually important because a lot of people forget about this, and so all the status emails about the account go to this live ID email that they never check. Particularly if you don't use the account for a while, Microsoft will tell you, hey, we're going to delete it because you're not doing anything, all right? So you verify that, and then your region. It's of course looking at my IP address because I'm here in London, but I'll put United States, and I'll tell it that no, I don't need extra email, and I'll hit continue. Now, this has just created a Visual Studio Online account for me, for my user. It has not created a team environment yet. Now, once again, this is where the nomenclature, where I wish they'd kind of kept things a little differently. Visual Studio Online is the umbrella thing out there, and it's in different parts of the Microsoft properties. We're going to see it here, we're going to see it later, that's in Azure, and it's on this property that we consider to be the Team Foundation Services part. So what you'll notice here that there's this option to create a free account, and it's like, well, don't I just create an account? Well, you did it, but you did. It's this weird thing. You can have logged in and done exactly what I did, and you get one benefit as a developer. right away, in that it will synchronize your Visual Studio settings if you use the same account to log into Visual Studio. Okay? Starting with Visual Studio 2013, they have this notion of profiles. You log in, and that does two things for you. Number one, if you have an MSDN subscription of a particular type, it validates your rights to use Visual Studio, and you have to log in every 30 days. That's a new feature of 2013. The other thing it does, though, it will synchronize your Visual Studio settings, things like your font sizes, your colors. So if you go to a new machine and log in, it'll be like your other machine. You can turn that off if you don't like that, but it is kind of nice if you have particular settings you like, and it just kind of moves between machines. And their plan is to do additional things, but that's what you get for just stopping right here, doing nothing else. You just made your life a little better with Visual Studio 2013. What we want to get to is this ability to, hey, I want to use version control in the cloud. I want to track my work. So that's where we select create a free account. And what it wants to know is, hey, give us a server name as part of the URL. So every account lives in the visualstudio.com domain today. If you ask them about custom domains, they tell you that's on the backlog. How high on the backlog? Well, it depends on how people are screaming about it. And right now, it's not that high as far as I can tell. In either case, for now, you have to decide you want it to be there. Now, if I pick something like mcw.visualstudio.com, my company being MCW Technologies, what do I find out that that's not going to work? And that's because it's already in use or it's reserved. In addition, they've done the standard, let's take away certain bad words, as well as they've taken away probably well-known Microsoft brand names and things like that. Beyond that, you might say, okay, well, I'll use my name. Well, turns out I've already done that. So MCW is my company one, then I've also got Brian R. Now the nice thing about this, you're thinking, well, you've got two, huh? That costs a lot of money? Turns out no. As you'll see in the detailed slides, you can have an account for free, and you can add up to 4 of your friends. Now you don't get all the advanced features, but you get all the core features you would need to do development in the cloud. You get version control, you get work tracking, and you get the ability to have 60 minutes of free team build a month. Okay? All for free. And right now they've said that this is for the foreseeable future, right? Barring Microsoft going out of business, I guess. So at this point, I need to think of something that will work. So we'll go for something like SALHR, or Software Architect London. And it can also be SALHR, I guess. It's looking, it's checking, and hopefully it looks like this one's going to work. So if the internet stays alive, we should have an account. Now, account creation can take anywhere from a few seconds. I did a talk like this last week in Washington, D.C. It took about 10 seconds to create. But we're going to have to shift those bits all across the planet now. All right, that's it. So the time it took me to blather, probably I think we're looking at 45 seconds and we timed it. I have a new TFS account. If you ever install Team Foundation Server, anybody install a TFS server in 45 seconds? No. Right, you can do it in about 30 minutes if you do a standard install. Now, as soon as you have the server already, have Windows installed, have it patched already, right? And then as soon as you're going to live with the free version of SQL Server and not a real version, right? So that's pretty impressive. I now have a server available for my team. The difference is this is a geo-replicated data store-backed environment in the cloud that I don't have to back up. I don't have to worry about disaster recovery. That's now Microsoft's problem. And that's one of the really compelling things, particularly for small and medium businesses, to take away that care and feeding. I do a lot of consulting with companies. One of the first things I ask when I do work with them on TFS, I say, so how's your backup strategy? And they often say, oh yeah, we do backups. I go, good. What's your restore strategy? When's the last time you did a disaster recovery drill? Because backups aren't interesting. It's restores that are sexy, right? And most shops are not completely prepared for this. If it really was bad, they probably could not recover it easily. Now the good news is most people have good backups, so they're usually good, but if you don't test the backups, you don't really know that they're good. So at a minimum, there's a lot of overhead that the average team doesn't think about for sure. And depending upon organizational budgets, they often don't pay a full-time TFS administrator in a small and medium business. It's usually someone who's on the team. Now you back to the server the other day, right? Oh, yeah. Has anybody ever had to try and restore a team project after someone screwed up really bad? It's unpleasant, right? So we now have this account, which means if I click this link, I'm going to go to my account homepage. Now the first time you go to an account homepage, they have some getting started things on here. I apologize, you can ignore this. This is a project created by a friend of mine. You won't normally see that pop up. But what you'll see is a start screen very similar to this. And I mentioned similar to this because the service evolves quickly. The title of my talk says it all. Microsoft updates the service about every 3 weeks. Now sometimes the updates are non-visual. You don't see them, they're behind the scenes. Or sometimes it's a very small feature buried multiple levels deep. I'll point out one that came on track about 2 weeks ago that's just like that. On the other hand, sometimes they decide they're going to rethink the user experience and thus their cheese may move. So if the screen looks a little different, they may have decided to do something different. Well, let's break down a few things here. First of all, we have this big box here encouraging us to create your first project. Now this is what's called a team project. If you've never used Team Foundation Server, a team project is simply a work area for a team to collect all the assets necessary to create a software solution. That team project then will have some kind of version control repository. It will have some areas to track your work, so bugs, tasks, requirements, and it will have the ability to define builds so that you can bring your stuff together. Beyond that, there can be other things depending upon the version you're using as well as the features you're paying for in the case of Visual Studio Online. So in order to actually put something in version control, I need a team project. In order to track work, I need a team project. So you have a server account now, you have your Visual Studio Online account. Now you need to create one or more team projects within it. And so the first thing is you need a project name. And so we'll call this, how about Scrum Demo. Now a couple things about this. There's a little asterisk that might be completely visible there, and there's also one for version control, and there's even a little info bar here for the template. Things like the project name and the version control type cannot be changed once you create the team project. In addition, you can't change process templates. So let's cover a few things. Name. Yeah, this one's kind of silly and ridiculous, considering TFS has been out since 2005. Yeah, it'd be nice, but you can't. So think about the name. Particularly, people think, we'll say, well, we'll start with a code name, we'll change it later to the real product name. Yeah, you don't do that. So pick a name you're going to be willing to live with. The description can be changed, but you don't see that very often, so it's less important. The version control type is important, and I'll go into more detail, but basically we have two choices. Traditional Team Foundation version control, which is a centralized version control format. It's very good for storing source as well as just about anything you want. Or there's Git, which is the open standard distributed version control product. So what Microsoft has done is they have added this to the Team Foundation Server and to the online service. As far as a Git client, including things like Xcode or any other environment like Eclipse, it's just a standard Git repository. So you can clone it, you can do all the things you would do with Git, your commits, your syncs, all that good stuff. I'm going to start with Team Foundation version control. And then the process template, you'll notice they have three.
Sorry. Can you change the version control repository once you've created the team project?
That's why it's asterisk. So just like the name, version control, and template, once picked, you're stuck. Related to the version control, you can't change it after you pick it. What I would like to see, and we've been lobbying for, is realistically, I want both. I want both in a team project. And there's a couple reasons why. One is Git's not great at storing binary data. And part of the way Git works is when you go to work with it, you do what's called cloning the repository. Now, when it's empty, you just get a cloned copy. And then as you add data and do commits, when you synchronize, the clones are kept in sync. And that's one of the great things. If I walk up to a Git repository, say up on GitHub or Visual Studio Online, and I say clone, it gives me not only the tip, which is what most repositories have done in the past, right? Instead, it gives you everything, all of the history. Okay, so let's say you checked in an ISO file, which teams have been known to do. Let's say it's the Visual Studio ISO file, that's 3.6 gig. And let's say you put in Visual Studio 2013, then you put the update 1 version, and then the update 2 version, the update 3 version. Well, you have 4 versions in history, the original and 3 additional copies, each one over 3 gigs. When you clone the repo, you're going to pull down 12 gigabytes of ISO files. With TF version control, however, I can have a folder called ISOs, And then I can set up my mapping and say, you know what, I don't want to download the ISOs. I can cloak them and say exclude them. In addition to the way Git works, it's optimized around text. That's what it's optimized for. So what I really want is the ability to have both. A place to store my binary data, my documents, things that don't really belong in Git, but then have the flexibility to have Git. Now there's actually some tricks you can do with Git and TF version control, but fundamentally it's kind of a lifestyle choice. If you move from TFS, the first choice is going to make sense because it's going to work the way you expect it to work. If you've never used Git, I don't recommend you to suddenly choose that as your new starting point unless you've got time to learn with it. I guarantee the average developer is going to lose some kind of work with Git the first time because they will do something in an attempt to achieve some goal, and they want to understand how Git really works, and they'll find out their changes are gone. All you have to do is go to Twitter or search the internet and look for things like Git, Git pain, Git suffering, Git hurts. And I admit, I've done the exact thing. I got myself in a situation where I don't know what I did wrong, but I could not get things in the right state, so I just had to start over. Thankfully, my changes were minimal because I wasn't actually the main dev. I was just getting the code and trying to test it out. And I had changed some config file settings and tried to change a couple things. But whatever I did, I got in a state where I couldn't get out of it. And it was just easier just to say, forget it. And that's what most developers will do. Right? You'd rather just give up than really go down and figure out if there's a way out of it, or find someone smarter than you to help you. So take that for what it is. The process template question is, first of all, what is the choice? What am I picking here? Does it mean I have to do Scrum if I pick Scrum? Well, let's explain. The idea behind a process template in the original version of TFS was that not only were you getting a set of artifacts that would guide you down a path, they also provided prescriptive guidance. Microsoft still does this. The problem is most people don't read documentation. But at the end of the day, the process template determines what type of work items you'll get. Now, a work item in TFS, you can think of it as a base class if you think about programming, and that it's anything that you're going to track in the system. Every work item has some base data that it collects. A title. Whenever you create a work item, it gets a unique integer ID, a big int. Okay? Every work item can have an area and an iteration field, and I'll explain those in more detail later. It automatically tracks history, so when you make changes, it tracks which fields have changed. Those are all things that every work item has. Then, there are specific implementations of work item. However, you don't ever create a work item, you create a work item of a particular type. A task is a work item. A bug is a work item, okay? A requirement, it's a work item. So what's the difference between the templates? There's two things. The main difference is the data collected. The Scrum and the Agile templates tend to ask for less data to be filled in by the human than the last one on the list, which is the CMMI template. The CMMI template, also known as the more formal template, tends to ask for rich documentation. It's good for traditional shops that require lots of evidence about what's going on. The other difference is a little more subtle, and it's changed a bit over the years, particularly with the addition of what Microsoft calls their Kanban board. But every work item has a set of states and transitions. So when you create a new work item in the Scrum template, it's a new work item, a new task. And then once you save it, it's in a to-do state. The next state can be in progress, and you can either go from in progress, a transition, to done, or you can go back to do. Right? That workflow is defined in every work item type. The workflows, though, are different between the templates. As I mentioned, the CMMI template is much more formal. For example, when you open a bug in the CMMI template, it's not really a bug, it's not active. It needs to be reviewed, it needs to be triaged before it's actually a bug. You create a bug in the Agile, the Scrum template, it's a bug, right? It's live and ready, and it's just a matter of when you're going to work on it. So there's a different mindset. And then, like I said, if you read the documentation, there is a method to the madness, a recommended way of doing things. And Scrum in particular, right, has a very specific set of prescriptive guidance that if you're really doing Scrum and not Scrum but, it's what you do. And so the templates try to embrace that. So the Scrum template tries to embrace Scrum terminology and process. The Agile template and the CMMI template are based upon extensions to Microsoft's Microsoft Solution Framework, which for some people the going joke is MSF was Agile before Agile was cool. It was something that came out of Microsoft Consulting as well as consulting partners in the 90s as a way to do software development in a more cyclical fashion through cycles and iterative processes. And so the MSF templates use some vernacular from MSF, and then they split in that the Agile one is more agile, and the formal template follows some of the principles of the CMMI maturity model. The key thing is just because you're using the CMMI template doesn't mean you're doing CMMI. Just like if you pick the Scrum template doesn't mean you're doing Scrum. The bottom line is you'll find old school managers like the CMMI process template because it requires more data, more information. They always think that's a good thing. Developers tend to loathe it because it requires lots more paperwork, there's more ceremony involved in using the template, right? Just to get something done, you have to go through and get approvals and sign off. So we're gonna use the Scrum template. According to Forrester, like 80% of organizations out there are doing some type of Agile, and of those doing Agile, a really high percentage of that are doing Scrum, right? So we'll pick that, and we'll click Create Project. Now, while it's doing that, you notice there's a bunch of things here. These big purple boxes are all just places to take you to documentation and get help. These ones up here take you to specific features that, depending upon your account type, you may or may not have access to them. For example, load testing, I won't have access to with the free account because it requires a premium set of features. Now, once I've done that, I've now moved from my account homepage to my team project homepage. Within an account, I can have n number of team projects. So if you're playing around, a great thing to do if you're completely new to this and you've never used TFS or Visual Studio Online is go create 2 more team projects, one of each process template, and take a look at the differences and look at the docs. Obviously, if you know what you're doing, just pick the one that works for you. Now, this right here is just saying, hey, you're ready to go and you can open Visual Studio to connect. This assumes that you're running on Windows. I'm not. So what I'm going to do is do 2 things. First of all, I'm going to come back here to my home page. And I'm going to go over here to users. And when I look at users, and really I should have signed in and maybe this will leave me alone. Do that, thank you. All right, this should go away, thank you. All right. And we come to the Assign Licenses page, and it looks like I really need to go full screen on this because we're cutting off the page. There we go. All right, what you see here is there's Brian Randall CF, my email address, and my license type. And then over here on the side, it shows you that I'm using one of my 5 free basic licenses. More details on what that means in a bit. But if I want to add another user, I can come over here and type their email address. And I'm going to type my MCW address. And when I go to license, you'll see that I have 3 choices: basic, stakeholder, and eligible MSDN subscriber. I want to pick MSDN subscriber because this account is bound to my MSDN subscription. I'm going to click send invitation. And what that means behind the scenes, I'm going to get an email. Now, as I mentioned, if I was on Windows, I could click this to open Visual Studio. And you also see it's available here. But I'm on OS 10, that's not going to work. So what I'm going to do is switch over here to my virtual machine, which I went by, I think, right here. There we go. And you'll see I have Visual Studio in Windows inside of VM. So I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to log on. And we're getting low resolution issues, so we'll sign in. Now here I'm going to log on as brianr.mcwtech.com. Remember my password. Nope. Now, I have access to a lot of accounts, but what I want to get to is the one I just joined, which is that SALHR account. Now, I get to the home page, and what I see here is that if I click on Browse, I have access to no team projects. So what's happened is I've added Brian R. Tech to the account, but not to a team project. So you can choose which projects people have access to. So I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to go over to the Members option, and I'm going to add user Brian R. MCW. I'm going to save changes, close it. You'll see my picture shows up, and now if I go back over here, refresh, browse, now you can see I can see the team project, and now I can navigate to it And now once I'm in there, I can then come over here, whoops, sorry, scroll down a bit. I can select Open a Visual Studio. That's going to launch Visual Studio 2013. It's going to ask me for my credentials because I haven't saved them. If you only ever use one live ID, you can do this once, save it, and then it'll only prompt you about every 30 days. All right, it'll set a cookie. I don't use it because I do demos and I switch between accounts, so I have to type it in a little more. But what you're going to see here, this is going to sign me in. And if I go to Team Explorer, which is Microsoft's Visual Studio gateway to either TFS or Visual Studio Online, you can see that I have access to the features on the server, like builds, like work items. And if we go back to the website, you'll see there's work. Okay, we're going to be able to go over here to the build hub, things like that. Okay, so I've now accessed this team project. And then if I wanted to, I can also sign in up here to Visual Studio. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that when you create a Visual Studio Online account and map it to your Live ID and MSDN subscription, you can use that to sign into Visual Studio. And that's somewhat confusing. There's two sign-in locations. One for the Visual Studio IDE, that's the one up here. And then separately, you have the sign-in for a team project, which links you to an account. The key thing is you can have one user ID and account that's mapped to your Visual Studio session that then is used across multiple Team Foundation Server or Visual Studio Online accounts. Okay, so there's lots of flexibility. So at this point, I have a team project. I've connected to it for Visual Studio. I've added a team member, and I'm ready to actually do something. That whole period took us a few minutes. If we look at the magic clock, with me blathering, we probably spent about 10 minutes to 12 minutes there creating a server, creating a team project, and getting someone connected in a matter of minutes. And in your organization, you can't do that quick on your own. And so that's one of the big wins. So let's go talk about pricing in the bigger picture, and then we'll drill down into the features. I'll show you how you use version control, backlogs, and builds, etc. Okay, so what we're going to do here is find what I did with my slides. There they are. Okay. So, why? First of all, get started quickly, no brainer. The second one is great for the individual developer, the geek who wants to do code on their own, maybe do work for their church, their kids' school, whatever, their kids' football team, whatever makes you happy. A startup, you can get started easily for free, and you can invite 4 of your friends, and you get access to those core services. Another great thing, as you'll notice, is that I just used a live ID to log in. I didn't have to set up VPN, I didn't have to do any rigmarole to do that. If you use TFS on premises and you were, for example, say to hire me and say, hey Brian, we want you to come do some work for us, that would require you to set up on your network and your domain, probably have to get authorization, paperwork. I'm not saying you wouldn't have paperwork if I did work for you in Visual Studio Online, but you definitely wouldn't have to do all the VPN stuff. You would just say, Brian, what's your live ID? I would tell you, you'd add it, and I could get access. And then you would just determine which projects I have rights to, what I could do, everything. Right? Whereas if you give me access to your VPN, I have customers that I have laptops. I have 3 different customers that I have laptops for. Each one requires you to use their hardware to connect to their network with their VPN software and follow their network policies. Right? Traveling is fun. So you really get a more flexible model there. Lower operational cost. As you'll see, Microsoft does have places where they will charge you for using the service. But definitely, dollar for dollar, if you think about the actual cost of maintaining server hardware, whether it's virtual or real in your organization, the IT staff, and if you really are practicing good backup and recovery policies, you should have a significant lower cost of ownership from the process of maintaining a real server. Continuous feature delivery. This is one of those, you may or may not like this. Most developers do. It means that Microsoft is going to put new features out about every 3 weeks. And those will be available to you in your account. You don't have to do anything, you don't have to do any upgrades, they do it for you. The downside is it can create some of those who moved by cheese scenarios, right? Where, wait, wasn't there something here? Isn't this new? And so that can be somewhat of a friction point. I have asked the team and said, look, for major, especially when it's major UI changes, it'd be nice if there was a way for me to opt into that. And they've been working on that type of stuff. They do that on the server, so it's something we can probably see on the servers at some point. And finally, the ability to integrate with Azure. Microsoft's doing a lot of great things to integrate with their larger Azure ecosystem, which means if you are doing cloud-based development, you're going to find hosting your assets in Visual Studio Online to be a really compelling situation. Now, for a lot of people, then they want to say, well, what's it like if I compare the server versus the service? And notice there's a lot of green up there, which basically means that things are the same for all intents and purposes. There might be subtle differences, but in general, things like version control, work item tracking, test case management are the same in the cloud or on the server. The biggest difference you'll find is that sometimes the service is ahead, sometimes by weeks, sometimes by months, over the on-premises product. The on-premises product has gone to a more agile cadence. Whereas Microsoft used to update it about once every year, year and a half, the big updates were about every 3 years, and then they do a service pack. Microsoft has now released 2 major releases of Visual Studio. They did 2012 and then 2013 within a year. But within those cycles, they've had quarterly updates. And these quarterly updates aren't just bug fixes, they add new features. To date for Team Foundation Server, they've done 2 big updates, Update 2 and Update 3. There wasn't really an Update 1 for the server. They did do one for the client. Which means that they are on a rapid cadence that is mimicked on premises as well as the cloud, but the cloud is obviously faster because they control the service. They don't have to worry about some of the upgrade issues that you do. Heterogeneous, as you see, I created the project, I did it all from my Mac, right, in Chrome. It doesn't really matter when it comes to accessing the core features. Yes, there's no Visual Studio for the Mac, so I'd have to use things like Eclipse or Xcode. And in fact, if you use Eclipse, there's the Team Foundation, or excuse me, the Team Explorer Everywhere product that gives you that Visual Studio experience inside Eclipse. So they do have a nice setup there. Near zero setup and administration, collaborate with anyone from anywhere. You notice those are kind of orange, because on-premise it's a little more complicated. Definitely setup requires a little more thought. Administration is going to be more involved for an on-premises product versus the cloud. And collaborating with anyone, anywhere, yeah, you can do it, but once again, if you're using Active Directory, and for most organizations that requires VPN access, accounts set up, and working with AD groups, and just dealing with the general IT in your shop. Then there are some reds, and let's just talk about these briefly. Virtual test lab management. This one's just an issue of time. It's a no-brainer that at some point they will do something with Azure. They have to. It just makes sense. They have an on-premises product. But this is where we start saying, well, if we do this service as a truly cloud service, because the key thing with Team Foundation in the cloud, Visual Studio Online, is that they didn't just take TFS servers and put a bunch of VMs up in the cloud. They built the architecture from scratch to be a platform as a service solution. It is software as a service in that they replaced their core SQL Server architecture with table storage. All your assets are geo-replicated and backed up automatically because they use Azure Table Storage. And they use SQL Server still for some of the configuration and management stuff. But that was a huge change comparatively to the on-premises product. And so if you think about what would lab management look like in the cloud, it's going to be different than what it is today on-premises. That said, Microsoft's made no public commitment. This is Brian's hypotheses, but it makes sense that they'll do it at some point. SharePoint integration is interesting in that there's a couple thoughts there. First of all, up until a few months ago, there was a blocker based around authentication. Office Online and SharePoint Online use a different type of authentication scheme that Microsoft calls organizational IDs. And for a long period of time, Visual Studio Online did not support that. It does now, but that was one of the blockers. The second thing, though, was the reason they had SharePoint integration from the beginning, it started to change. There's different usage models. And so it's one of those things that if we do SharePoint integration, what will it look like? In particular, they've added one of the features to the core product of Visual Studio Online that used to be something that you got from SharePoint. And that was these dashboards, these ability to have these nice charts to show you how your team was doing. Now they haven't replicated them exactly in the new system, but the new system does support the concept of charts on your homepage. And so you can get a lot of the dashboard aspects that a lot of people use SharePoint for without using SharePoint. So that's nice because it also means that there's not this extra overhead of keeping things in sync, etc. The one thing that people do like is when you do need to interact with business users and you have a large organization that already uses SharePoint, It's nice to be able to link document libraries to TFS. There's some nice features in the on-premises installation. That said, the team has said, well, what if we gave you something like it, but it didn't require SharePoint? Most people say, yeah, that'd be great, right? We want a nice, easy way for non-technical users to get to things like specs and storyboards and docs without having to navigate, say, version control. So that's, they're thinking about it. So, but that doesn't exist, so that might be a blocker. And the last one, this one's kind of probably the one that pains me the most on this list right now, in that one of the key selling points of Team Foundation Server is that it has rich reporting. When I'm in development mode, the last thing I want to do is sit there and go to a meeting and explain to management how we're doing our project, what I'm working on, and everything else. Right? I'd rather write code. And let's be honest that, when I'm not writing code, you're creating impediments to my velocity. You're preventing me from being productive. Well, if you use Team Foundation Server accurately, in other words, you check in code and you use work items and say, this is what I did, and associate things, that data gets pushed into a data warehouse, and there's all sorts of great reports for management. They can see how work's being burned down, they can look at bug rates, they can look at all sorts of great things without ever bugging the developers. That's awesome. The problem with that is that the architecture Microsoft used when they built it was, go back in time, they started on SQL Server 2005. And so they used a combination of SQL analysis services, they used SQL's reporting services, SSRS, and that technology, it turns out, isn't in the cloud. Microsoft has been evolving their cloud-based BI story, which is what those products are a part of. If Microsoft wanted to do this, they would actually just have to put analysis services and SSRS in VMs up in the cloud. And that goes against everything they're doing with Visual Studio Online, right? In addition, what they built is now almost 10 years old. I mean, it's 10 years old from when they started building it. It's just under 10 years from when they launched it. It was in 2016 when it went GA and available. So maybe they want to rethink what they do for reporting, because that's what Microsoft is doing when they think about cloud-based BI. Their entire BI story is awesome when you look at the cloud, but it's not the same as on-premises. So those are adoption blockers. And related to that is that, I don't have it as a bullet point, but it is something to think about, is if you want to go to the cloud and you said, I want to give these up, turns out I can't just say, take your server and push it to the cloud. There's no just backup and restore option today. It requires manual intervention. And it's not always pretty depending upon your team project, or team projects. You might be wondering why. Well, there's one reason in particular. Since day one, organizations have been allowed to customize and extend Team Foundation Server. Those customizations and extension points don't necessarily translate to the cloud. One is because with you on the server, you can put things on there. They have a notion of plugins. They have a way for you to programmatically do things. They don't want you doing that in a shared multi-tenant environment. Oh, okay. What if I didn't do that, Brian? Well, the big one that people do is around the customization, which is work items have a set of fields, and I haven't shown you one yet, but you get the idea: a title, a description for a bug, things like that, steps to reproduce. Well, it turns out that sometimes organizations said, I need extra fields. For example, when a bug is filed, if it comes from a user, I want the help desk ticket ID. Lots of organizations have help desk systems that they use. So they need a correlation field, so they want to add that. If you use the project server integration, it adds custom fields. In the cloud, you can't customize yet. Now, once again, well, why? Well, there's a couple reasons. One, when they're building the service, the last thing they want to do is have the extra moving pieces, right? Because that means compatibility issues they have to think about. So first of all, they want to get it right. Because remember, they didn't just take the VMs, put the TFS in a VM. They rebuilt it. Then they said, once again, we did this customization story back in the early 2000s. We've learned a lot. We've had some pain. What would be the right way to do it in a cloud-based multi-tenant environment that's going to have rapid updates? They haven't answered the question yet. So that is probably the biggest set of impediments to just saying move your stuff up. Now, yes, in theory, if they did a pre-check and you didn't do any customization and you had no extensions, they should be able to do it. Well, my guess is based upon their statistics, because they get what's called SLIM data from customers that opt in. let alone the customer engagements that they have and their support engagements, right? They can go through all that data. They probably have seen a high significant portion of their customers have customized to some degree. Now, I've worked with a lot of customers who have, and some when you tell them that, they go, well, we give it up, right? I've actually done upgrades where they said, I don't care about those old projects, we just want the new stuff, so just help us move our code over and we'll move forward. They've actually left some of their old stuff behind. But Microsoft can't know that for all their customers, they have to go by the data. So that's why, some of these things may or may not be important, but the other thing is you can't just move whole hog. That's why I encourage people that are using TFS today to try Visual Studio Online with a pilot project. See how it works for you, and then start thinking about if we want to migrate, what can we do? And also then at that point in time say, hey Microsoft, what's your current statement? Because what I say today could change literally in 3 weeks. All right? Now the last one is fairly new. This came online this year, about mid-year. And what this gave us was a big step forward. The downside to live IDs is that, most of you probably have a live ID, but you might not even have a live ID that's good use for an organization. You might have it's a gamer tag, right? It might be your online handle you use for Xbox Live. And maybe you don't need that showing up in the reports for your company. So you have this issue that you have a live ID that's managed now by the user, not by an organization. And the second thing is, managing all those users can get cumbersome if it's, I just send email to everybody and say, send your live ID, let me know if you change it, did you change your email to match your corporate email so you get the email notices. And so Microsoft set up to now that you can bind an Active Directory installation on premises to Azure, and once you do that, you can extend that into Visual Studio Online, which means you give rights to people via their corporate ID, and this means your email address for your company. And now you can log on with that username and the same credentials, and it will authenticate you against your AD, which means if you get fired, they can revoke your access through AD just like they would on premises. And so that's a big win for organizations. The only downside to this is it requires some setup, and it's not something that the average developer is going to be able to do. Because you typically need someone with AD, well, you do need someone with AD rights to go and set this thing up. But that does make the thought of moving forward better for companies, and if you do go to this step as part of your pilot process will ease the transition point to try, hey, let's do a real project up here. The nice thing about it is, though, you can still bring in people like me with their live IDs. You can mix and match within your account. You just have to manage them, though, through the Azure AD interface and not your corporate one. So how do you get it? Well, it's free. For 5 users, no problem. With those 5 users, you get 60 minutes of shared build time, and I'll show you build in just a second. Then they said, guess what? If you have an MSDN subscription, and it's any one of those, you get access also to all the basic features. Free. In other words, you paid for it as part of your MSDN. That means if you had a company of 5 developers who had MSDN, let's just say Pro, you can have an account with those 5 users plus 5 additional people for free. Those free ones are useful often for your admins, right? People who aren't going to do dev but need to do basic user management, stuff like that. Okay? You have 10, you now have 15 users, right? All for free. Now, let's say though that you want to add some additional users and you're not going to have Visual Studio. Well, you can have basic users for just under 13 quid a month. Okay? Those are the current UK prices for Microsoft's website. They have a special SKU here, a special option, which is, let's say you want to try this out, but you don't have MSDN. Let's say you've bought Pro before, but you're not in the current version. You can actually go with a monthly subscription for up to 10 people. It's not limitless, but for up to 10 people, where you spend about £29 a month, and that gives you a user access to the Pro features, as well as Visual Studio Professional. Okay? And then if you don't want to stop using it, you can turn it off. So this is useful for projects where you need to add a few people temporarily, particularly if you're bringing people over that maybe work in a non-Windows environment or don't work in Visual Studio normally. Then they have the advanced SKU, and I'll cover what's in the SKUs on the next slide. They have an advanced one that's about just under £39 a month. If you do the math on this, this starts to get expensive. And that's what they want. They don't really want a ton of people going for this. What they would rather you do is get MSDN. This only makes sense for people that really need some of the advanced features, like test features, and you're just not going to buy the Visual Studio product, right? It just doesn't make sense. And just as an FYI, Microsoft has a special one for enterprise. Now you can't just go buy this off the shelf. And in fact, all the subs anymore, or you can't just go buy at large scale and get the good price. It's something called platforms. This is designed for people like Java developers who want access to things like the Windows Server for testing, even Office and things like that, but don't use Visual Studio. So it gives them the subscription option to the tools and gives them the benefits without having to pay for Visual Studio. For testers, Microsoft has a specific test SKU, but it assumes they're going to use the test product to the fullest, in particular the Windows client. If you have testers that are living on Macs, that might not be worth the cost differential, and so that's one of the reasons why you might buy them this SKU. Testers, business analysts, and some of those are people that you might buy this SKU for, particularly for short-term projects. So you can do this monthly and turn it on and off, okay? Now, what are the capabilities? Well, the basic things you get are things like unlimited project repositories, agile planning, work item tracking, code discussions, and work item chart view. That's all basic, and you get that with the basic, the pro, and the professional with MSDN subs. Okay? So yes, all those features in green are free. Okay? Everybody gets those for those 5 free users, or if you buy additional basic or pro, etc. If you step up, you get advanced capabilities, and you get Agile Portfolio Manager, which I'll show you in a second. You get access to team rooms, work item chart authoring, and you can request and manage feedback between your users. That comes, web test case management, that comes as part of the advanced SKU. This is actually a fairly recent change. Originally, to get the web test case management, you had to go to additional subscriptions. You had to have one of these subs to get this. They recently pushed that up into the advanced capabilities. So if you spend that, 39 pounds a month, your testers can have the web-based test case stuff without having to buy Test Pro. Otherwise, you have to buy Test Pro. I don't know what it costs in pounds, but US it's in the $2,500, $2,900 range retail. But no one should pay retail, by the way. If you're paying retail, it's hard to do that. You have to have a very small shop and only buy 1 or 2 licenses. Typically, the volume discounts start around 5 accounts, usually on a 2 to 3 year commitment plan. And so you can save a significant amount of money by doing a subscription with Microsoft. So based upon what Visual Studio have, if any, you get a certain set of features, okay? So in my account right now, the Brian CF account only gets the green stuff. However, the Brian MCW, because I have an ultimate subscription, means I get everything, okay? And you can mix and match those within an account as you see. Now, everything I talked about so far is different for the user. So one user can see less than another user. Then there's what are called shared resources. The 2 that are currently available are the cloud build and cloud load testing. For cloud build, you get 60 build minutes a month per account. So you can basically run a build a business day for free, an average build. If you want to run more builds, it costs you about, the rate is listed as just over 3 pence a minute. Okay, so not very expensive. If you think about properly buying a server as well as the licenses that go with it to run your own build server, you'd have to run a lot of builds to equal that. So that's quite cost effective. That said, you could run your own build server for those specialized builds and mitigate some of those costs. Cloud load testing. So cloud load testing, the way it's charged is by virtual user minute. You specify the number of users you want, and then it's based on how long the test runs. So if I said I wanted 250 users and ran the test for 1 minute, I'd use 250 virtual users. Run for 10 minutes, I'd use 2,500 minutes. And so they give you 15,000 free minutes per month per account, and additional ones are 0.02 or 0.002 pence. So it's less than, what would be, you get 5 minutes, 5 virtual user minutes per pence, right? If you did the math, I don't know. Obviously it's fairly cheap, but of course if you ran a long load test with thousands of users, you could spend some money, right? Okay. By the way, this one's interesting. The US price for this is actually 0.02 pennies. So This is the one place where you guys are getting hosed on the exchange rate. Everything else is actually translates fairly well based upon the rough current exchange rate. That said, to use cloud load testing, you have to have at least one user who has Visual Studio Ultimate, because in order to interface with it, you have to do that. And then finally, something called Application Insights, which, as I had mentioned earlier, is a way to get analytics about your application availability. And I have a talk on this this afternoon. Okay, so I talked about security. You're always using HTTPS. You're using Azure Storage SQL database. Out of the box, you get live IDs with no hassle. Federated identities requires a little more work with AAD, but once again, it is possible now. Right now, all the data is coming out of the Central US Data Center. They are working on choice. In particular, they're looking to enable you, when you create your account, to specify where you want it, and that would mean for you over here in Europe, you'd be able to pick one of the Europe data centers for Azure. Obviously, for people in the EU, as well as Asia, that becomes important both from a performance standpoint, as well as theoretically illegal. I say theoretically because my government seems to think it can do all sorts of things. So in either case, that's something to be aware of today, though, that your data will be stored in the US initially if you start. TFS was developed initially to be a WAN-based product. It's designed to be very flexible and give you a good experience over an internet connection. In addition, with Git repositories, you can work completely offline with your source code. Even traditional TF version control works much better offline with using TFS or Visual Studio Online with Visual Studio 2012 or 2013. They have a concept of what we call local workspaces that make things a lot better. When it comes to availability, they've been averaging 99.93%. This data is a little old. I haven't gotten any new figures. They do provide a 99.9% financially backed SLA, so you can read the SLA agreement on the Visual Studio Online site. That basically means if they're down, they will give you credits back to your account if you're paying. Obviously, if you're not getting any, paying for anything, there's not much they can do to give you anything back. They're not going to suddenly put money in your pocket. But if you are paying, they will give you a rebate. And they do a bunch of monitoring, they do a bunch of stuff. And the bottom line is they worked really hard to make this scalable. Now, it hasn't been perfect. I'll tell you honestly, up until launch, I had really good availability to where I don't think I was down more than a couple hours. There's been a couple of maintenance windows where they've done stuff and they might restrict creating new team projects, or there might be services that aren't as available, like builds. But I had really good luck, and I've been really happy using it. I've been using it full time for my team's work since fall of 2000, sorry, not fall, June of 2011. So we're over 3 years now that I'm using the product on a daily basis. That said, they've had some growing pains when they went GA, when they made it available worldwide and really started promoting the product. And they've had some growing pains caused by growth as well as just Azure. Things aren't perfect, right? They're still learning. Brian Harry, who's in charge of it, is very transparent. His blog is a useful indicator of what's going on, what's coming. And when they've had bad things, he's tried to explain what happened and how they're going to make it better. Sometimes to the point that you'd be surprised how transparent they are. But they really want you to understand that they care and they really are working to create a service that is available for you to use. Now this is mostly for your reference. It basically just defines the commonalities between the server and the service. Once again, in general, things are almost exactly the same, except you don't have control of the server, of course. You're in a multi-tenant environment, so you're in this isolated structure, so you have a certain baseline of rights. And a team project, right, is where you store all your stuff. Create a team project, pick the thing, right? Name, description, process template, version control flavor. Name you can't change, process templates you can't change, version control flavor you can't change. So make sure you know what they are. That's why you want to play with this. Give it a try before you go up there. There's 3 built-in templates. On premises, because of that customization, you can actually take any of the built-in templates and save as and rename them and customize to your heart's content. You can't do that in the cloud right now. Process templates, just give you some reference data. I talked about this already. Pick one. definitely RTF and the docs. The docs are really good. They put a lot of effort into them. And if you've never used it, it's helpful to look at. If you're used to the product online, on premises, just remember you can't customize, and otherwise it should be, for all intents and purposes, the same, minus you don't have the reports. I mentioned you can't customize. Once you pick it, you can't change it. This just talks about adding users. Just some more details here. The bottom line is users can have permissions. When you add a member, they have read-write access, the way I did Brian at mcwtech.com. Obviously, if you want to add other users, you can add stakeholders. Stakeholders are special users. That's actually a new feature that they enabled recently. Stakeholders get basic view rights to things like work items. They can't mess with code. The key thing is that they don't require extra money. They're entirely free, and you're allowed unlimited stakeholders. So you can think of them as readers. That said, there are security groups you can use to give someone who actually is a developer normally, but you can add them to another team project and say, for this project, I just want them to be able to read. I don't want them changing anything. Yet you don't want to make them an observer because maybe you want them to be able to look at source code. So you have more flexibility there. I showed you adding users. No stress there. Getting connected. This isn't entirely true, but yeah, if you really want to, if you're a Windows developer, yeah, you need Visual Studio. An important point is even the free version of Visual Studio, the Express editions, will connect to Visual Studio Online as well as Team Foundation Server now. This was a change they made in 2012 that allows you to use the core features completely for free from Visual Studio. That's pretty awesome. Team Explorer Everywhere works. In fact, I will show you that right now since I am on my Mac. I'll go over here to Eclipse. I think I will. Nope. I'll click OK. And notice it's going to ask me to sign in. And let's go full screen here. Let's decides to come back. Beach ball. There we go. Now what you'll see here is that I'm looking at source code up in Visual Studio Online. I have work items. And as a point of reference, let's go over here to Visual Studio. Notice there's work items. In other words, notice how I have these tiles in Eclipse and Visual Studio. So the Team Explorer Everywhere plugin is available free. You need to have the appropriate license to access Visual Studio Online. But this allows Java developers or any developer using Eclipse on Windows, OS X, and yes, various flavors of Linux and Unix to have a great integrated experience inside that environment. Xcode, on the other hand, Apple doesn't let people write plugins. That's just their style. However, you can use Xcode in Visual Studio Online because it does support Git-based repositories, and so you can at least link source and then just use the browser for everything else. In fact, that's one of the great things. If we take a look here at, for example, let's look at a work item, and let's go, let's see if I have any bugs. I have 2 bugs, great. So here's a bug, okay? You can see acceptance criteria. Let's scroll this over a bit. You can look at the history for it, okay? And if I go over to the web, and let's actually come down here, let's fire up Safari. Let's go to mcw.visualstudio.com. And let's go to the Coffee Team project. So to point out, I'm in the Coffee Team project, if you look right up there with the fingers pointing. If we go to the website and we go to queries, let's bring this up here. There's Eclipse is blowing up. there's the same history, and others and videos confused. So let's open up the other one. Right, I'm able to have that great experience. So if I have Eclipse or Visual Studio, I can just stay in the zone, right? I have access to everything from within Visual Studio. If I happen to use something like Xcode, well, I go to the website, I get access to all the core features. The main reason I want Xcode, Eclipse, or Visual Studio is to have that source control integration, to have my debugger, my development environment. So it really is a really first-class experience, just about anywhere you want to be. And of course, as I mentioned, any Git client. So the web access, you know, this is a big step forward. If you look at where they've gone from web access, in 2008 we really didn't have anything. Then Microsoft acquired a small company that made a web access product. They added that into the product in 2010. It was good. 2012 they really started reimagining things, and in 2013 and forward we've really seen a very rich experience there, to the point that if we go back to that homepage in Safari, you'll notice that I have a bunch of customization that I've done to it, including my open bugs as a chart to render to those dashboards. I have my build information here. I see that I have 2 open bugs. I can see my burn down chart. I can see my teams over allocated, right? So they've really rethought what it means to have a great web experience. And once again, HTML, JavaScript. Now, tracking your work means you need to have a place to do that. In Agile circles, that means having a backlog. A backlog simply is an ordered list of feature requests, wishes from your users. Now, depending upon your process, you might call it something different. Microsoft follows this when you work in the templates, in that in Scrum, you create PBIs, product backlog items. In the Agile template, they're called user stories, and in CMMI, they're called requirements. At the end of the day, they're the same thing. The difference is the data collected. It turns out the layout of the forms is different, but that's less important. And then the actual workflow can be slightly different, that notion of different states and transitions. So what you can do in this interface is you can define your various work items, and you can use the Kanban board to kind of see your work in progress. So if I go over here to Safari, and I go to my backlog, you'll see I have a couple bugs, and I have a product backlog item. I can add a new item, such as so like that. That's all it took to create it. Now that only gave me the type, the title, and a new state. And if I open it up though, I can come in here and fill in more detail. Okay, and there's other fields that I can use. For example, if you're on Windows, they have a storyboarding tool built into PowerPoint that allows you to graphically explain things out. You can, of course, attach just about anything you want to a work item, so you can have more formalized specifications. You can link. You can link to any URL you want. You can also link into version control if you want. So if you want to store a spec in there. I don't generally recommend that for users that are not devs, but for things with your dev technical documents, maybe your encryption algorithm or your business rules that are very specific to code, you can store those in version control and just point to them from the work item, which is really nice. There's obviously full history that describes what's going on. You'll even see the state transitions here. And you can change assignment. For example, I'm going to assign this to myself, and I'll save this. And then I'm going to change the state to approved. And then notice it shows you that state transition. It went from the new state to the approved state, and Brian did that. You can also add history comments. And I can assign an effort in something like story points. So I can say this is require 50 story points. The business value is 100, very high. And so I'll save that, and what you'll see here is the discussion only. If I put a comment, it shows up with my picture. If I click all changes, I can see any discussion comments, but I can also see the fields that were changed. I can see the new and old value. Okay, things like history. the title, who it's assigned to, area and iteration are all common to every work item. Now you might be wondering what iteration and area are. Well, they're really straightforward. Iteration is when you're going to do it. Area is the general category of what you're working on. You have free control over both. For areas, you can think about, if you're building a product like Office, you might have top-level areas that are Excel, Word, PowerPoint. And within them, you might have sub-channels. You can go up to, I think it's 14 levels deep on those trees. So you can actually use those. Those are really helpful when you use things like Excel, or if you're on premises, the reporting tools, to slice and dice things. Because you can do cross-cutting across different types of work items to see all the work that went into a particular part of your product. Now, we have that, but we also now have free-form tags. And so if I do something like that, my tags will show up here, and then I can go over here and also do this and do Apple, Eclipse, Mac. And when I save it, I can then come over here and filter and say, show me just the Apple ones, or show me just the Eclipse one. And I can say all. So it just provides another way of filtering things. This is nice because it's more freeform, whereas using areas, which you define at the home page and is just defined by someone who has certain rights, the tags are more freeform, whereas here I can go over and define a richer structure. So this is mobile, and then we can say this is desktop. And once I do that, I now can go back to those work items and open this up and say that this belongs to the mobile area. And this one belongs to desktop. Now, as far as when, you'll see that these items have been marked as sprint 1. So Scrum uses the vernacular sprint to describe a time box, a period of time as you're moving forward. And so what you're able to do here on the home page is control when that is happening. So if you go to schedules and iterations, you can go over and change the dates. So this current sprint is through the 17th of this week. And so I can then assign my work to those sprints. For example, I can take this new one, drag it over to sprint 1, and then if I go to my Kanban board, I can see my new items, my approved, my committed, and done. And these numbers here tell you how many you have in that particular state, and you can move it from states by dragging and dropping. The smaller number is telling you your maximum number you want to have at any one time. So it's a high-level project management feature. When I drill down to the sprint, though, I can see a task board and see a more developer-centric approach. So I can see I have work that's to do, in progress, and then done. All right? Now, everything I just showed you is available at the free level. On the other hand, if you do have one of the paid SKUs, you can actually create higher level items like features. And features are things that go beyond a single sprint and are used to do enterprise or larger planning. You can also create items above that, things like epics, etc. But the bottom line is the work tools are very powerful. You have queries that you can run. There's a set of built-in queries. For example, all open bugs is one I created, whereas open impediments is built in. And depending upon the way the work item is structured and the rights you have, you can then come in here and create charts. So I can say, let's create a bar chart. Let's group it by state. And we'll click OK. And so now anytime I can look at these charts in detail, or I can also come over and say, for example, work in progress. And I can do a stacked area. And how about remaining work? No, I don't have any data. No, okay, well that's not gonna work. But the point is I can create other charts, and then if I want to, as you see, I can pin it to the home page. And they'll show up here. So lots of flexibility. The last thing you'll see here is that this is showing the status of my builds. Visual Studio Online supports any type of Windows build, and what's really cool is, yes, it supports even Java builds. So if I can set it to where it works with either a Ant or Maven configuration, I can set up a build and it will run up in the Elastic Build service, and then I can come here and see any of my build history. So I ran one last week. I get a detailed build report of what happened, and then I can put the results up on my homepage so I can see builds that succeeded, failed, or what, or partially succeeded. Partially success is an option in the build definition that says if it compiles okay, that's partial. If some of the unit tests fail, that's considered an in-between. Or you can say that if unit tests fail, the builds fail. I'm a fan of that. I think builds are either they succeed or don't succeed. There's this partial stuff to me is for weenies. But the bottom line is that's useful also. And so if we look at the rest of the stuff, version control, core component, TF version control stores any type. You can also use Git repos. You can choose on a per team project basis, so you have that flexibility. And that's the other thing is your process can be on a per team project. So you can have teams doing Scrum and a team using the formal template. That's often useful when you're working with things. The gentleman mentioned working with NHS software. So in the US, I know anything that does with healthcare has to follow what are called HIPAA regulations in the US. And therefore, they tend to be a little slower moving. They tend to want those gates, those evaluations. They also like lots of documentation. Anything that works with the FDA in the US is a big pain. So they have to really document things. So you can mix and match within your account. Oops, sorry. So the future, constant evolution, every 3 weeks just about. A good example of something that was small but came in the last update. If I go over here to my backlog and look at a work item, and I open up this field, notice the description is taking up this small square. Well, what I can do now is they've added this little button that makes the field giant so I can type in a more larger space when I have a bigger monitor. That's an example of just a little piece of enhancement that we got because they do 3-week enhancements. This won't be available on premises until the next major update, either which is an update, quarterly update, or the next version of TFS. My guess is we'll see this in a quarterly update, but nothing's for sure. Same thing with tags. We got tags first. Those are things that will show up on the service, and that makes it nice. Lightweight browser code editing. This is something you'll find via the Azure portal. Right now, it's limited to mostly web-style projects, but it shows you where Microsoft is thinking to where at some point, I might be able to edit C# in the cloud in my browser. With the work on Roslyn, this is all possible. It's not there today. Where you can really see this in place is that the core code editor experience that you see here is actually used in SharePoint Online first. But it's also available for your web projects in Visual Studio Online via Windows Azure. Oops, keep hitting that gesture. Load testing, this one's really a no-brainer. You simply define the load test, and they go forth and set the load test agents and do everything. You get one copy of Visual Studio Ultimate to take advantage of it, and you get 15,000 user minutes. So that's pretty compelling.
What about specs of servers that the load tests are running on then?
I'm sorry?
The specs of the servers that load tests are running on?
They don't document that. They're virtual machines. So remember, it's targeting your stuff. So you decide what your stuff is, the stuff being load tested against. So your website, you determine what it's talking to. It can talk to your real servers in your company as long as they're internet facing, or you can have them hosted in Amazon or Azure VMs, or even a PaaS solution. That's up to you. The VMs they're using are just, they've sized them appropriately to handle a certain number of virtual users. They don't tell you what they are. And honestly, you don't care. All you care is that they can generate the load you've asked for. And there is a limit. It's something like 16 agents times, I think it's 500 virtual users. I mean, you're limited to like 5,000, I think, users per load test. But that's a pretty significant portion, particularly if you just do basic extrapolation. Generally, most things, if you're going to find problems, they fall over pretty quickly when you're doing that. And then finally, the hosted build controller. As I showed you over here in Eclipse, I have a build. And if we look at the build definition, you'll see it's pointing up here to the hosted build controller. So it's using the build up in the cloud. However, if you set one up, and I have one in a VM that's offline, I can actually use my own custom one when I need to do specialized things that aren't supported up there. It's useful, for example, also if you're using beta SDKs, they tend to stay on the release cycle. So if you do a lot of Azure testing, for example, you can get yourself the latest tools before they update the VMs. So, App Insights, I have a whole talk later, but the bottom line is, how do you know what to build? You need better information. Whoops. So all these links will take you to information, news, service status, release archive. The release archive will show you when they release something. This is a fairly recent screenshot. If you go look at the details, one of the things they do is there's a column over on the right that tells you when this feature is available on TFS on premises. So if the feature's already shipped, you'll see it in things like update 1, update 2. On the other hand, if it's not available yet, it'll say future release. So if you want to see what's coming next release of TFS, just go look at this timeline. The link is on the previous slide. Finally, if you're not happy with something in Visual Studio Online or TFS, tell Microsoft about it. Go to visualstudio.uservoice.com and vote for things you care about. Lots of great things out there, like Renaming Team Projects has over 5,000 votes. Push it over the edge. So the bottom line is connections without barriers. Just need a modern web browser and an internet connection, and you can connect to Visual Studio Online. Cross-platform, hopefully you saw me with Eclipse, web-based, I'm using OS 10. It really is a modern Microsoft that really is embracing just about everybody. Yes, they provide a great experience for Windows developers and Visual Studio users, but they're really trying to make this a great open platform for developers. And it's software as a service. Let them focus on backups. Let them focus about disaster recovery. You focus on building your applications, which is what you're good at. And ultimately, continue to evolve, monitor and learn, and improve your process. So thank you very much for coming. Hopefully you learned something. And just remember, it's free to try out. So get your live ID, go out there, get yourself an account, stake your flag in the ground, and do something. Spend some time to learn something new. And if you have questions, contact me later. Thank you very much.